Hey, happy Thursday. Welcome to Healthy Conversations. Today's conversation is an answer to one of the questions that you submitted to me in the Ask Eliza poll. If you're not already on my email list, make sure you hop on there because once a month I send you a link to submit a question to me, and then you'll see me pop on and answer the question live for you on one of these healthy conversations. There's also a poll that I send out. A number of things happen on the weekly newsletters and communication. So if you're not already on my email list, make sure you hop on that. So this question came from one of you, and I actually really loved it, by the way. It made me stop and think and really reflect. And so the question was, if you could go back in time, having experienced what you have between then and now, what would you add or subtract from Brain Powered Weight Loss, my book? I loved that question. It really got me thinking. So for those of you who don't know, Brain Powered Weight Loss is the book I wrote. It came out in 2017, which means, from a publishing world, it was published by Rodale, which is now part of Penguin Random House. But in the publishing world, that meant that it was written, earlier than that. So I wrote the book in 2015, and then it was published in January of 2017. So when I wrote the book, that was about 8 years ago now. And at the time, if you've read the book, I was the executive director of a company called Wellspring. And that company was owned by a parent company. And it was really important when writing the book that I stayed within the clinical lens that we were doing clinical work at the time. So when someone asks, how do you feel about the book and what would you add or subtract? The beautiful part is that I still stand by everything that is in the book. The theoretical model and theoretical principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, some of the dialectical behavioral therapy, dealing skills and things, all that's in there is still very sound, very empirically validated, and really sound clinical work. And at the time, I was running a company and also training hundreds of clinicians, and it was really important that the book reflected the clinical the clinical theoretical model that we were working with at the time. So I stand beside all of that. I stand behind all of that, and I still really believe in all of the clinical work that is in the book. If anything, in the 8 years that followed the publishing of that book, I got beautiful opportunities and even more entrenched in the science of how we actually change as humans. Truly, just change in general. What keeps us from changing, what allows us to change, how we change, why we don't change. That has always been the sort of driving question of my body of work. And if anything, it has expanded. So built upon this strong clinical theoretical model that is in brain powered weight loss, but continued to build. So all of the work that I've done since brain powered weight loss is a continuation of that work. And often when people will come into my other programs or work with me one-on-one, they'll ask me, how is this different from the book, which I think is a fantastic question. And what I will say to them is the brain powered weight loss is kind of level one learning, right? It's this really solid foundational material of starting to examine your relationship with food, right? And some of the things that get in the way, and some of the things that drive us to eat that, are outside of our either conscious awareness or conscious decision making, right? It's a really great introduction and foundation to that work. And then all of the work that I've done since then has built upon that. And I have gotten significant training in things like cognitive neuroscience, behavioral science, psychoneuroimmunology, nutritional psychiatry, energy psychology, the nervous system. Most recently, the last couple of years, a deeply trained path in nervous system work and the importance of that. And so if anything, the work that I do now doesn't negate brain powered weight loss in any way, but it builds upon it. And so as I was thinking through that, the question was, what would you add or subtract to brain powered weight loss? It's interesting. People have asked me, are you writing another book? Will there be another book come out? And the answer to that, I believe, is yes. I don't know exactly when it will come out, but my second book is already sort of in the universe, in the work that I have done since then. And it will be a continuation of the work that was started in brain powered weight loss. And really, this theoretical model that I have been honing over the last, well, 20 years since I started this work, but even more specifically or deep dive the last, let's call it 5 to 7 years, um, has really emerged into a theoretical model of my view from what I've learned and experienced both in clinical settings, research settings, educational settings, and then doing work with clients. My view of a theoretical model of the stages and phases of how we actually change and what gets in the way of that and what allows us to get out of our way to be able to change. So that's what the next evolution of the second book will be, but brain powered weight loss is a fantastic foundation for that, right? And if we're just getting exposed to concepts like you know a concept that's in the book called like chaining, really, this thing happened, and can I look back at the links in the chain that led to this thing that happened? Or cognitive distortions, how often do I get caught in black and white thinking? Or mind reading or things like that. If this is your first introduction to those types of concepts, brain powered weight loss does a great job of introducing that. I did want to always, as always, I went and looked back at the sort of nutritional principles that I put in there. There's, 10 principles of nutrition. And honestly, I still, even after all these years and everything that I've learned and all the research that comes out, I still stand behind those 10 principles of healthy nutrition. I would say the one tiny caveat that I would make is principle 5, choosing carbs with a lower moderate glycemic load. The glycemic load has had some, people have gone in and out of the impact of whether or not glycemic load is really what we should be paying attention to. Most recently, it has morphed into sort of like the insulin sensitivity and the individual impact that food has on our glucose moderation, right? And all that is to say, if I were to change any tiny thing about the nutrition principles, I would probably change principle 5, which has to do with carbohydrates, and just stick to, ideally choosing nutrient dense, complex carbohydrates that are not hyperpalatable and that aren't, in the book, I talk about simple versus complex carbohydrates. And I would maybe take out the glycemic load piece and leave it at, choosing carbohydrates that are complex and take longer in the body to break down because they have more fiber or nutrient density, and staying away as much as possible from the hyperpalatable foods just because of the impact that hyperpalatable foods have on the brain and the body and digestion. But, that's a small tweak. The 10 principles of healthy eating that are in there, it's still what I come back to even in my clients today, is that, the concepts of focusing on nutrient dense whole foods as much as possible, but also, not being too rigid and saying entirely no to something that you want to eat because that creates a rebound effect. I mean, everything in there, the 10 principles of healthy eating, I still stand by, which was really cool to see, that even with all the research and should you go carnivore and should you go vegan and should you go this, like the 10 principles in there are very, very sound. And then finding your way of adhering to those principles is, still the way I teach nutrition today. So that was cool. So I hope that makes sense and I hope that answered your question, in that brain powered weight loss I see as sort of really solid foundational material. Oh, a question I get asked a lot is, do you still stand behind the concept of a healthy obsession? I absolutely do. So healthy obsession, of course, is my definition of the healthy obsession in the book is a sustained preoccupation with the planning and execution of target behaviors used to reach a healthy goal. And as I've mentioned to people before, I have tried to use a different term or a different way of describing that, but truly the people who find a healthy weight, who at once struggled with their weight, right? So that part is key. This is for people who once struggled with their weight, right? If you've never struggled with your weight, it can be different. If you've once struggled with your weight, the people who find success long term with sustainability and don't find themselves yo-yoing back and forth have found a way of a sustained preoccupation, and I mean preoccupation, with the planning and execution of target behaviors used to reach a healthy goal. And what that means is that they've found their way. There's not one way, they have found their way of being able to be consistent, that what they're doing is sustainable, right? That they don't let life circumstances knock them off course, and they found their way to come back to those consistent, sustainable behaviors over time. And that takes an intentional focus on the behaviors that will lead you to health. So this sustained preoccupation with the planning and execution of target behaviors used to reach a healthy goal, I still stand behind that. And sometimes people will get a little cringy at the word healthy obsession, but truly, as I talk about in the book in Brain Powered Weight Loss, in the environment that we live in today, access to food, types of food, engineering of food, portions of food, marketing of food, everything in our environment is set up to trigger our brain that is already primed to look for food. So if you've been with me for any period of time, you know that our brain, because we have not changed in the time period that we have had access to food, right? The time that we have had access to food is really, really small in comparison to how long this brain has been around, right? So our brain developed hundreds of millions of years ago, right? Not the human brain, but like the brain that we now have started developing millions of years ago. And the amount of time that we have had access to food regularly has been pretty short, like a couple hundred years. Okay. So the brain hasn't caught up to evolution and our access to food sources. The brain is already designed and wired to seek out food because it was scarce for most of the time that we've had a brain. Okay, so the brain is already wired to seek out food. Then you couple that with the type of food environment that we as humans all, I should say, in first world countries, okay, we're gonna put that aside, but let's assume that we're in first world countries right now. The type of food and access to food that we have access to now, combined with a brain that is already looking for food, okay, because it was scarce, this is a recipe for us to overeat without even really meaning to, right? So when I wrote healthy obsession, I mean healthy obsession, that the people who now are maintaining and sustaining a healthy weight in the modern food environment are the people who have found their way of having a healthy obsession, sustained preoccupation of planning and execution of target behaviors used to reach a healthy goal, right? In an environment that is constantly triggering us to eat and overeat, it takes an intentional focus on health and what I want and the goals I'm working towards and how to be healthy in order to combat all of the triggers that lead us to eat. So I still stand beside healthy obsession. Okay, I hope that answered your question. I think I rambled on a little bit longer. If you have a question for me, make sure you jump on my email list. You can also submit it to me over email. You can submit it to me over Facebook or YouTube or anywhere that you're watching this. I'd be happy to answer your question on a healthy conversation. All right, everybody. See you next week.